The first time anyone noticed him, he was already dying. Not in the dramatic way movies show, not with sirens or collapsing in public. He was dying quietly, slowly, inside a large private room on the top floor of a private hospital in Manila. His name was Richard Hale, an American millionaire who had built his fortune in logistics and shipping, a man who once owned 3 homes, 2 yachts, and more money than he ever learned how to enjoy. By the time he arrived in the Philippines, none of that mattered anymore. Cancer has a way of stripping titles from people. Millionaire, CEO, investor, those words stop meaning anything when your body starts betraying you. Richard had flown to Manila because the treatment was more affordable, because his doctor suggested a quieter place, and because, if he was being honest, he didn't want to die alone in a cold American hospital where no one remembered his name without checking a chart. He didn't tell his children he was coming. He told them he was traveling for business. They didn't ask further. The nurses came and went. Doctors were polite but rushed. Everyone was professional, efficient, distant. Richard understood. That distance was familiar. He had lived his entire adult life surrounded by people who needed something from him: money, approval, opportunity. Affection always felt conditional. Then one afternoon, a man walked into his room carrying a plastic tray with soup, crackers, and a small folded towel. "Good afternoon, sir," the man said gently. "I'm Manuel." Manuel wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a nurse either. He was a hospital aide Filipino, mid-30s, soft-spoken, with tired eyes and a posture that suggested someone used to standing quietly in the background. Richard barely looked up. "Just leave it there," he said. Manuel did, but instead of leaving, he adjusted the curtain slightly so the harsh sunlight didn't hit Richard's face. He moved the water closer to the bed. Then, without being asked, he wiped a small spill on the bedside table. "I'll be back later," Manuel said. "If you need anything, just press the button." Richard grunted in response. He assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Manuel came back every day. He learned quickly how Richard preferred his pillows stacked, how he liked the TV volume low, how he hated being woken abruptly. Manuel remembered small things without being told. He spoke only when necessary, but when he did, his voice was calm, steady, unhurried. When Richard snapped at him one morning for being late with the water, Manuel apologized once and still came back the next day with the same quiet patience. "You don't have to keep coming," Richard said one afternoon, irritation sharp in his voice. "I'm not exactly pleasant company," Manuel smiled slightly. "That's okay, sir. You're not required to be pleasant." That caught Richard off guard. No one had spoken to him like that in years. As the weeks passed, Richard's condition worsened. Treatments drained him. Pain made him short-tempered. Some days he refused to eat. Some nights he stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, haunted by thoughts he had avoided for decades. Manuel never left early. When Richard threw up, Manuel cleaned without flinching. When Richard lost control of his bladder, Manuel handled it with dignity, never embarrassment. When Richard grew silent for hours, Manuel sat nearby, folding towels, giving him the comfort of presence without pressure. One night, after a particularly bad episode, Richard whispered, "Why do you care so much?" Manuel didn't answer right away. He adjusted the blanket first. "Because someone should," he said simply. That night, Richard cried for the first time since his divorce 20 years earlier. He told Manuel things he had never told anyone else about building his company from nothing, about missing birthdays, about choosing work over people and convincing himself it was necessary. He talked about his children, successful but distant, and the last phone call he'd had with his son, which ended with a polite, "Take care, Dad." Manuel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He didn't offer inspirational quotes or advice. He just stayed. Sometimes he shared small pieces of his own life, his mother back in the province, the long hours, the reason he worked double shifts. Not to compare suffering, just to be human. Richard started waiting for Manuel's shift. Other staff noticed. "Your favorite aide is here," a nurse would joke, and Richard would pretend not to care, though his eyes always lifted when Manuel entered. One afternoon, Richard asked, "What would you do if you had a lot of money?" Manuel laughed softly. Sleep more. No, Richard said. Really? Manuel thought for a moment. I'd fix my mother's house, buy land, make sure no one in my family ever feels like a burden. Richard nodded slowly. The idea of not being a burden hit him harder than expected. Months passed. Richard grew weaker. His handwriting trembled, his voice thinned. Doctors began speaking in softer tones. His children finally visited. They were polite, awkward. They stayed an hour, checked their phones, asked about the weather. They promised to call more often. They didn't. After they left, Richard stared at the door long after it closed. Manuel came in quietly. Do you want water, sir? No, Richard said. Then, after a pause, stay. Manuel pulled up a chair. I spent my life thinking money meant I mattered, Richard said. But the only person who hasn't walked away from me is you. Manuel looked uncomfortable. I didn't do anything special. You stayed, Richard said. That's everything. A week later, Richard asked for a lawyer. The lawyer came with papers and questions. Richard answered calmly, deliberately. Manuel stood quietly in the corner, unaware that his name had just been written into a document that would change his life. When the lawyer left, Manuel asked gently, Are you okay, sir? Richard smiled faintly. I am now. On Richard's final night, the power went out briefly during a storm. The room was dim, lit only by emergency lights. Richard's breathing was shallow. Manuel held his hand. You don't have to stay, Richard whispered. I know, Manuel said. But I want to. Richard squeezed his hand weakly. Thank you for not giving up on me. Those were his last words. The news barely made a ripple. An American businessman passed away overseas. Paperwork was filed. A body was prepared. Manuel attended the small memorial service held in the hospital chapel. He stood at the back, wearing his only black shirt. A week later, he was called into the administration office. A man in a suit introduced himself as the executor of Richard Hale's estate. You were close to Mr. Hale? The man asked. I worked with him, Manuel said nervously. The man nodded. Mr. Hale left specific instructions. He slid a document across the table. Manuel read it once. Then again. Then he stopped breathing. Richard had left him millions. Not a tip. Not a token gift. Millions. Enough to change everything. Manuel shook his head. There must be a mistake. There isn't, the executor said. Mr. Hale wrote a letter. Would you like to hear it? Manuel nodded, tears already blurring his vision. The letter was simple. Richard wrote that Manuel was the only person who treated him like a human being when he had nothing left to offer. That he stayed when it was inconvenient, uncomfortable, unrewarding. That loyalty, compassion, and dignity were worth more than any business success he had ever achieved. He never gave up on me, Richard wrote. So I won't give up on him, Manuel cried openly. The money didn't turn him into someone else. He fixed his mother's house, bought land, paid for his siblings' education. He kept working for a while part-time because he said it kept him grounded. When asked why a millionaire still wore simple clothes and rode a jeepney, Manuel would smile and say, because someone once taught me that dignity isn't something you buy. Richard Hale's children contested the will. They lost. The judge ruled that care, presence, and humanity were not accidents. They were choices. And Richard had chosen to reward the one person who never treated him like a transaction. Years later, a small scholarship existed under Richard Hale's name, quietly funded by Manuel, for Filipino healthcare workers. No press releases. No interviews. Just gratitude passed forward. Because in the end, the millions weren't really the story. The story was about a Filipino who stayed, and an American millionaire who finally understood what real wealth looked like just in time.